Cop humiliates black man in public. Then realizes he just arrested the most powerful man in town. Imagine getting handcuffed, mocked, and humiliated by a cop right in front of a crowd just for walking home. Now imagine the officer realizing too late that he didn't just arrest a random man. He arrested the most powerful figure in the entire city. What happens when the system tries to crush the very person who holds the keys to dismantling it? Stay with us, because what you're about to witness is more than a mistake. It's a reckoning. Do you think the cop would have acted the same if the man was white? Should powerful people expose injustice or fix it quietly behind closed doors? Comment below. Your voice matters more than ever. What if I told you a black man was arrested for doing absolutely nothing, just walking down the street? And what if I told you the officers had no idea who he really was? This isn't just another story about bias. It's the moment the system got caught red-handed, and the man they tried to silence, he had the power to bring the whole thing crashing down. Stay with me, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. The air on Bourbon Street always held a certain kind of weight. Not just the thick humidity of New Orleans, or the scent of spilled liquor from the night before. It was something else, something unspoken, a tension that lingered between the jazz notes and uneven footsteps of early morning. People passed through every day, the guilty and the innocent, tourists and drifters, locals who knew which corners not to turn at night. But that morning, something cracked beneath the surface of routine. Something snapped quietly at first, but loud enough to echo through an entire city before the sun would even reach its peak. He wasn't supposed to stand out. That was the irony of it. Dr. Marcus Ellington, tall and deliberate, wore his charcoal coat loose against the warm breeze, his stride steady like someone with no reason to rush. He'd lived long enough to know that too much confidence in a black man could be mistaken for arrogance. And arrogance in certain eyes could be mistaken for threat. But this wasn't arrogance. It was knowing. It was earned. He passed an art gallery on the corner. Tourists inside pretending they understood the brushstrokes, and then a cafe where a woman with tight blonde curls paused to lower her sunglasses just long enough to track his path. Her gaze lingered. Her phone slipped from her purse. Her thumb hovered. 3 blocks away, Officer Cassandra Monroe was sipping her third black coffee. Her eyes scanning the dispatch board in her cruiser, bored and ready for something to justify the badge on her chest. Her partner, Officer Bradley Knox, was leaning on the dashboard, one hand on his holster, like it was part of his body's second nature. They weren't looking for trouble, not really. But they were always looking for a reason. And as the dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker, suspicious male, dark hoodie walking west on Bourbon, they exchanged a glance. It took them less than 60 seconds to spot Marcus. He was doing nothing. Nothing at all. Just walking, hands in full view, no phone, no bag. And yet something in Monroe's spine straightened. It was instinct. She'd later say experience. But it wasn't. It was conditioning. It was centuries of it cloaked in training manuals and performance evaluations. She flipped the sirens once, not for alarm, but for effect. The cruiser pulled up beside him, tires hissing against the curb. Marcus paused, no surprise in his face, no fear, just a slow, steady breath as he turned. "Sir, step over here," Monroe ordered, already out of the car. Marcus didn't argue, didn't even ask why. He stepped forward, the exact amount of compliance he'd practiced his whole life. Not too eager, not too defiant. His voice when he spoke was velvet wrapped in steel. Is there a reason? Officer Knox was already circling, hand twitching. "You match a description. We've had a report." "What description would that be?" Marcus asked, one eyebrow barely lifted. Monroe didn't answer, not directly. She glanced at Knox. Let's see some ID. He reached into his coat slowly, theatrically slow, and pulled out a leather wallet. When Monroe opened it, the silence between them hardened. Her eyes scanned the badge inside. Internal Affairs Department of Justice federal level. Dr. Marcus Ellington wasn't just a man walking down the street. He was the man who watched the watchers, the one who investigated police departments for racial profiling, for excessive force, for violations of civil rights. He was the man people whispered about in break rooms. The name attached to officers who vanished behind closed doors and never returned to patrol. Monroe blinked once, twice, but the conditioning screamed louder than reason. "Fake," she muttered. "You think I haven't seen this before?" Marcus didn't move. "Call it in," he said. "You'll find out quick enough." But she didn't. She looked at Knox. He looked back. 2 years on the same beat, dozens of arrests together. They didn't need to speak. "Turn around," Knox barked. "Hands behind your back." And so Marcus turned, not because he was guilty, but because he knew what happened to black men who refused. The cuffs clicked shut with a finality that always came too early and too late. As Monroe read him his rights, her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. The moment the back door of the cruiser slammed shut, the city changed. From the second they rolled into the precinct, something in the air shifted. The desk sergeant raised his eyebrows at the name on the booking sheet. One of the older lieutenants stood too quickly when he saw who was being walked through in cuffs. Whispers trailed them through the hallway like shadows. The kind that said, "You just arrested the wrong man. And it's not just his name that's going to cost you." Marcus didn't speak again until he was alone in the holding room. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than accusation, his presence louder than protest. And when he finally did speak to the internal affairs officer, who had arrived red-faced and sweating from the neck, it was only 6 words. "You're going to want your lawyer." His silence was heavier than accusation, his presence louder than protest. And when he finally did speak to the internal affairs officer, who had arrived red-faced and sweating from the neck, it was only 6 words. "You're going to want your lawyer." Because what had started as an ordinary morning, what Monroe and Knox thought would be just another routine stop, had just become the beginning of their worst nightmare. Dr. Marcus Ellington wasn't just someone's brother, someone's son. He was a storm in a suit. And the people who had cuffed him, they had just handed him the match, and the system was soaked in gasoline. They didn't know it yet. But by the time Officer Cassandra Monroe handed over the intake file, the tremors had already started. Not loud, not obvious, just quiet. Invisible fractures forming beneath their feet, waiting to split open. The kind of shift that doesn't make headlines at first, but burrows deep into institutions, reputations, and the illusion of control. Inside the holding cell, Dr. Marcus Ellington sat with his back straight against the cold concrete wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the only sound besides the occasional cough from someone down the corridor. He wasn't pacing, he wasn't shouting, he was still. Too still. And that stillness scared people more than a raised voice ever could. He had been trained for situations far worse than this. As a federal officer in internal affairs, Marcus had sat across from crooked sheriffs, forced resignations from lieutenants with more badges than conscience, and stared down commissioners who thought their power made them untouchable. But never, not once, had he been cuffed, read his rights, and locked away for doing nothing more than walking in his own city. But this wasn't about humiliation. This was an opportunity. In the main office, Sergeant Everett Monroe leaned over the precinct's intake computer. He wasn't the type to rattle easily, but as he scrolled through Marcus's federal record, something in his jaw twitched. Verified clearance. Department of Justice Internal Affairs. High-level security access. Recently assigned to investigate multiple departments across the southeastern region, including this one. The realization hit like a blow to the ribs. He turned to the desk officer. "Call the captain. Now." In another part of the station, Officer Cassandra Monroe sat at her desk, writing her report in neat, aggressive handwriting. Her thoughts moved faster than her pen trying to rationalize what she'd done. She wasn't racist. She had black friends. She'd dated a Puerto Rican guy once in college. That had to mean something. Her instincts had spoken. That's all. But deep down past the defenses and self-justifications, something gnawed at her. The calm in Marcus's voice. The cold professionalism in his eyes. She'd seen it before in higher-ups, in people who held real power. And she had shackled him like he was just another low-level thug on the corner. Her hand shook slightly as she signed her name on the report. Officer Bradley Knox, meanwhile, wasn't thinking about Marcus's calm demeanor or the badge. He was in the break room muttering to two other officers about how this would all blow over. That guy was probably faking or overplaying his position, he said, sipping from his chipped mug. They always act like they're somebody until the paperwork says otherwise. But the paperwork had already spoken, and it screamed trouble. By noon, Captain Derek Langston had arrived. He was the type of man who wore his authority like body armor, sharp-pressed uniform, emotionless stare. But today he didn't look like a man in control. He looked like someone trying to undo a disaster before it made the evening news. "Where is he?" Langston snapped, storming past the front desk. "In holding," Sergeant Everett Monroe replied. "Room 6. Langston didn't wait. The moment he stepped into the dim hallway, the atmosphere turned heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Officers scattered. Phones went quiet. And when he pushed open the holding room door and locked eyes with Marcus, everything stopped. Marcus rose slowly. No anger in his expression, no panic, just a calm, measured readiness. "Agent Ellington," Langston said, voice low. "I'm Captain Langston. I wasn't made aware you were in town." "You weren't supposed to be," Marcus said coolly. "I was conducting a quiet evaluation. Undercover." "You could have said that," Langston exhaled. "This is a serious misunderstanding." "No," Marcus said, stepping forward, his cuffs still binding his wrists. "It's a symptom." There it was. The line that changed everything. Langston flinched. He knew what Marcus meant. This wasn't just about one mistaken arrest. This was about culture, about the quiet, corrosive disease of assumption, about a department that had stopped asking questions and started reacting with fear. Behind them, someone knocked on the door. Sergeant Everett Monroe entered, face pale. "Sir, the media just got a tip. There's a camera crew setting up outside." Langston's face turned to stone. He turned to Marcus. "I'll release you immediately." Marcus didn't move. Too late. And then the moment arrived. A young female officer stepped in holding a manila folder with trembling hands. "Internal Affairs. They just sent an email. There's a formal complaint already logged. They're asking for a full incident report, video, audio, officer statements, everything." Langston looked at Marcus. "Is this what you want? A spectacle?" Marcus smiled faintly. "What I want is justice. What happens next, that's up to you." Across the city, phones buzzed, emails spread, rumors flared like wildfire. The black community in New Orleans, already used to mourning more names than they could count, heard whispers of a wrongful arrest. But not just any man, a federal agent. One of their own. And in living rooms, barber shops, and church halls, people began to talk. Not with rage, but with strategy. Because if someone like Dr. Marcus Ellington could be handcuffed on the street with a federal badge in his wallet, what did that mean for every young man without credentials, every teenager walking home, every father late for work? Outside the precinct, the storm gathered, not with violence, but with silence, with planning, with a city beginning to wake up. And inside, holding room 6, Marcus stood alone in the eye of it all. Waiting, watching, calculating. Because the officers thought they had detained a man. But they had actually unleashed a movement. The morning after Dr. Marcus Ellington's release, the precinct on Royal Street felt less like a place of law and order and more like a battlefield. Quiet, smoldering, waiting for the next strike. Conversations were hushed, Eyes shifted quickly, phones were checked more often than usual, and in the space between casual chatter and nervous silence, something unspoken lingered. Fear not of criminals, but of consequences. Captain Derek Langston stood at his office window, arms folded behind his back. He watched the small cluster of reporters forming outside their camera lenses, pointed like loaded weapons. What unsettled him most wasn't the press. It was the fact that the story was evolving faster than he could control. He had lived through controversies before. He had seen officers caught in bad traffic stops, in ambiguous shootings, in allegations that never reached a courtroom. But this was different. Dr. Marcus Ellington wasn't an outsider crying foul. He was the system, a man trusted with the dirty work of cleaning house, and now he had been wronged publicly, definitively, in a way no one could spin into misunderstanding. The internal memo came through at 9:17 a.m. Subject Departmental Review and External Oversight from Department of Justice Internal Affairs Division to Command Staff New Orleans, 7th Precinct. Effective, immediately, all officers directly or indirectly involved in the detainment of Agent Marcus Ellington are to be placed on temporary administrative leave pending investigation. The news spread like oil through water. Officer Bradley Knox read the email twice, blinked, then slammed his locker shut harder than necessary. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "That guy baited us. He set this up." Officer Cassandra Monroe sat on a bench nearby, pale and tight-jawed. She hadn't spoken much since the release. Her name was all over the preliminary reports. Her voice was on the body cam audio. The restraint in her tone, the command in her posture, it all painted a picture she couldn't erase. But it was the footage of Marcus that unsettled her the most. The way he didn't resist, the way he didn't flinch, as if he had already seen every version of this play, knew the ending, and simply waited for it to collapse under its own weight. For Cassandra, the silence had become unbearable. In the break room, in the locker room, even at home where the phone had stopped ringing and her sister hadn't replied to texts in 2 days, shame had a smell. She realized it clung to her, like smoke-thick sour and impossible to wash out. By noon, 2 IA agents, Agent Howard and Agent Kim, arrived at the precinct wearing crisp suits and hollow expressions. They weren't there to explain. They were there to observe, to document, to tear through every file that might tell them if what happened to Marcus was a one-time error or a pattern. And deep down, most of the staff already knew the answer. That afternoon, a community meeting was called across town at a modest church in Tremé. The pews filled with residents, pastors, teachers, and youth leaders. Faces worn from too many vigils, too many names etched into murals. A banner read, "We believe in accountability." Marcus didn't take the microphone until nearly the end. He hadn't come to preach. He came to listen. To take the pulse of a community that had watched him rise from a local kid with nothing to a federal officer with influence, and then watched him get slammed against a wall like he was still 12 years old and out of place. When he finally stood, the room hushed, not with fear, but reverence. "I'm not here today because I'm important." Marcus began, his voice low and clear. "I'm here because I'm not supposed to be. Because somewhere along the way, someone decided that no matter how many badges I earned, how many departments I served, my skin color still overruled my credentials." He paused, letting the words sit heavy in the air. "I wasn't profiled as a threat because I did anything wrong. I was profiled because I existed in the wrong place, wearing the wrong skin, walking too confidently in a neighborhood where I wasn't expected to belong." There were nods, quiet tears. A child nestled against his mother's shoulder whispered, "Mama, is he okay now?" Marcus continued. "But here's what they didn't count on. I'm not alone. I never was. Every injustice has a tipping point, and every mistake, especially the ones made in uniform, has a cost. It's time they pay it." The room broke into applause. Not rowdy, but resilient. It wasn't the kind of cheer that fades after a headline. It was the sound of resolve. Back at the precinct, chaos simmered beneath the surface. Several officers called in sick. Others deleted years' worth of texts and emails, hoping to cover their tracks before the next wave of scrutiny arrived. But the truth had already started to unravel. Complaints that had been dismissed, patterns that had been ignored, names that had been quietly moved around rather than disciplined. The thin blue line wasn't just fraying, it was splitting open. Captain Derek Langston stood in his office watching the walls close in and realized too late silence had never been protection. It was a confession. And Dr. Marcus Ellington, he wasn't finished. And Dr. Marcus Ellington, he wasn't finished. The hallways of the New Orleans 7th Precinct were quieter than they had ever been. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that follows resolution or rest, but the suffocating silence that settles over a place after impact when no one knows what to say and everyone is waiting for someone else to speak first. Officers moved like ghosts through corridors they no longer trusted. The break room had become a war zone of side eyes and sudden exits. Loyalty had turned into suspicion, and the badge no longer felt like a shield. It felt like a target. The storm had arrived, and no one could outrun it. The first to fall was Officer Bradley Knox. A federal auditor discovered a pattern of fabricated stop reports, years of traffic stops in black neighborhoods, with no citations filed, no reports written, and no body cam footage ever logged. It didn't take long to connect the dots. Knox was placed on unpaid leave pending investigation. But the department knew what that meant. He was done. His locker, once cluttered with photos of his kids and old football trophies, was cleaned out before sundown. More followed. Internal Affairs began holding closed-door sessions in the old interrogation room. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very room where suspects were once grilled was now where officers were sweating under the heat of their own policies. Names once whispered behind closed doors now echoed across open complaints. Officer Cassandra Monroe, Lieutenant Adrian Tate, Sergeant Milton Graves. The old guard, the ones who shaped precinct culture with smirks and slaps on the back, suddenly found themselves drowning in the weight of paper trails. And every time a new officer was pulled in for questioning, Dr. Marcus Ellington's name hovered like a ghost in the air. He had become a symbol, unwanted by some, necessary to others. To the officers who had once dismissed him as overpolished, he was now a reckoning. But to the city outside, the people who had waited too long for someone to speak for them, Marcus had become a voice louder than the sirens, steadier than the law. Outside the precinct walls, things had shifted. A group of local business owners in the French Quarter released a joint statement demanding transparency and reforms. Clergy from different faiths began hosting roundtable discussions with community activists and local leaders. High school students marched from Congo Square to the courthouse chanting Marcus's name alongside calls for justice. And on the steps of City Hall, a mural had begun to form, vibrant, defiant, painted by artists from across the state. At the center was Marcus's face. Above it, he walked. They stopped. We rose. Within the precinct, pressure turned to collapse. Captain Derek Langston tried to maintain control, but his hands were tied tighter every day. City Council had mandated third-party oversight. His officers refused to speak to the press. The public relations officer resigned without warning. Even the union, once so ready to protect its own, had gone silent. No statements, no support. Only legal disclaimers and procedural footnotes. Langston stared at his calendar, noting how every scheduled staff meeting was now accompanied by an exit interview. One afternoon, he called Cassandra Monroe into his office. She hadn't said much in days, but her silence said everything. When she entered, her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed her. "I need to know where you stand," Langston said quietly. Monroe didn't blink. "I stand where I should have stood 3 years ago." He exhaled slowly, nodding. "Then you know what's coming." She did. Her resignation letter was already folded in her back pocket, but not everyone left quietly. Late that evening, as the sun draped the bayou in deep orange, Officer Paul Granger stormed into the locker room and punched through the glass of a vending machine. He was tired of being painted a villain, he said, tired of being lumped in with bad actors just because he wore the same badge. But when his voice rose, the room didn't nod in sympathy. No one clapped him on the back. No one backed him up. Instead, one rookie fresh out of the academy, wide-eyed and painfully sincere, asked a question that cut deeper than anything else had. "Then why didn't you ever speak up?" Granger stared at the kid, mouth open, words caught somewhere between his lungs and his ego. He didn't answer, because there was no good answer. And the moment passed like a final breath before collapse. In that silence, a new kind of honesty took root. Some officers began meeting in off hours not to defend themselves, but to unlearn. A volunteer-led workshop on racial bias filled faster than anyone expected. Formerly anonymous whistleblowers started attaching their names to old complaints. A group of female officers formed an internal coalition, demanding safer policies for both officers and civilians. Something was breaking, yes, but maybe for the first time, it was breaking in the right direction. And Dr. Marcus Ellington. He didn't bask in the unraveling. He stayed busy. Too busy to gloat. Too committed to let anger lead. He attended hearings, advised legal teams, stood beside families whose sons and brothers had been silenced long before him. His face was on television, but he never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His truth was doing the shouting for him. Back inside the 7th Precinct, one thing had become clear. Uniforms no longer guaranteed loyalty, protection, or silence. The unraveling had come not from the outside, but from within. Thread by thread, officer by officer, truth by undeniable truth. Back inside the 7th Precinct, one thing had become clear. Uniforms no longer guaranteed loyalty, protection, or silence. The unraveling had come not from the outside, but from within. Thread by thread, officer by officer, truth by undeniable truth, and what came next would change New Orleans forever. The courtroom was still when Dr. Marcus Ellington entered, not in silence, but in breath. Expectation. Every eye followed him as he walked down the aisle. The rhythm of his footsteps, steady, deliberate, echoing off marble walls that had heard too many stories of injustice whispered between their cracks. But this story, his story, was different. It wasn't whispered. It was now spoken in full, without shame, without apology. Outside the city of New Orleans held its breath. Bourbon Street pulsed in the distance, but not with celebration. It was more like the pause between thunderclaps, electric and waiting. News vans crowded the courthouse steps. Protesters and supporters stood shoulder to shoulder. Strangers once divided by silence, now united by clarity. The man they had once mistaken as just another name in a file now stood for something larger than any case. But Marcus hadn't come to claim vengeance. He had come to finish the work. As he took his seat at the witness table, the weight of the moment did not bend him. In fact, it steadied him. Across from him sat the officers who had wrongfully detained him. Detective Elise Warren, her expression hollow with fear and fading defiance, and Detective Daniel Prescott, whose once arrogant posture had slouched under months of headlines, hearings, and public disgrace. Their defense team sat stone-faced, knowing full well what the tide outside these walls already knew. This was not a trial about procedure. This was a reckoning about perception, about patterns, about power. When Marcus spoke, the courtroom stilled to listen. He didn't rage. He didn't shout. His voice was even textured by the weight of lived experience. He spoke about the day on Bourbon Street, not just the moment he was handcuffed, but the lifetime of moments that led to it. The years of walking into stores and being followed. The job interviews where he was told he was overqualified. The sideways glances, the polite exclusions, the justified fear. But then he spoke about something else. About hope. He talked about the night he was released and how he sat alone in his apartment and wrote out names not of enemies, not of officers, but of the kids he'd mentored. The families who'd sent him letters since the story broke. The strangers who stopped him on the street with tears in their eyes, saying, "I've been waiting for someone to say what you said." He talked about how he didn't press charges out of anger, but out of necessity. "If I stay silent," he said, "then every young black man who watched that footage learns a dangerous lesson that even the truth won't protect you. I can't let that be the final word." And then he turned to face the courtroom, not just the judge, not just the jury, but everyone. "I'm not here to destroy anyone," he said. "I'm here to build something better in the ruins of what we thought was justice." His words didn't draw applause. They didn't need to. They settled into the bones of the room like something ancient and holy. The judge, a stern but fair woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, leaned slightly forward after Marcus finished. There was no gavel strike, no scolding of the gallery, just silence. Respectful, earned silence. When the ruling came, it was swift. Both officers were found guilty not just of misconduct, but of violating constitutional rights. Detective Elise Warren was dismissed permanently from service and barred from rejoining any law enforcement agency in the state. Detective Daniel Prescott faced federal review for prior complaints that had been swept aside. More investigations would follow, and the precinct would never be the same, but for Marcus, the real victory came afterward. In the weeks that followed, community review boards were approved citywide. Training protocols changed. The mayor issued a public apology, one that actually sounded like it meant something. And Marcus, instead of retreating, began teaching workshops across the state. His sessions weren't just about rights. They were about visibility, about courage, about healing. One night, after speaking to a crowd of nearly 200 officers in Baton Rouge, a young white recruit approached him, nervous, fidgeting. "I was taught to see people as threats," the recruit admitted. "But today I saw you, not just as a victim, but as someone I want to learn from." Marcus didn't say much, just nodded. That was enough. Because in the end, truth doesn't need vengeance to stand. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it, and someone human enough to listen. And Dr. Marcus Ellington, once mistaken, once handcuffed, once doubted, had become the voice that changed a city. Not by shouting it down, but by making it rise up. Dr. Marcus Ellington's story was never just about a wrongful arrest. It was about what happens when one man stands firm in the face of an entire system that tries to reduce him to a stereotype. It started with a routine patrol. A pair of officers making a decision based not on facts, but on fear wrapped in assumption. A man walking down Bourbon Street minding his own business was seen not as a citizen, but as a suspect, simply because of the color of his skin. But what those officers didn't know, what they never even thought to ask, was who Marcus Ellington truly was. They saw a hoodie. They saw a man alone. They didn't see the decades of service, the quiet influence, or the countless lives he'd already touched. And in that moment, their ignorance didn't just cost them a mistake. It sparked a reckoning. What unfolded next wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a movement. A city forced to confront its own reflection. A police department stripped bare of its protections and forced to ask hard questions. And at the center of it all, Marcus didn't choose revenge. He chose responsibility. He could have let the headlines fade. He could have cashed out and moved on. But instead he spoke. He led. He built. And because of that choice, his story became more than an isolated injustice. It became a blueprint for justice in motion. The lesson here isn't just about race or law enforcement. It's about accountability, humanity, and the silent power of integrity. Marcus didn't just change the conversation in New Orleans. He reminded us that silence is a luxury that justice can no longer afford. That when we look the other way, we don't stay neutral, we become complicit. In a world where judgment is often instant and change feels painfully slow, Marcus's story urges us to pause, to think, to challenge our instincts, Because behind every description, behind every assumption is a human being with a story we don't yet know. And maybe the most radical thing we can do in today's world is listen. So what can you take from this story? That real change begins with uncomfortable truths. That leadership doesn't require a title. It requires courage. That every step you take toward justice, even if it's small, matters. Speak up when something feels wrong. Ask questions when silence is easier. And most of all, see people, not profiles. If this story moved you, if Marcus's strength inspired you, or made you see things differently, we invite you to join us in this conversation. Share this message. Talk about it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Every like, every comment, every subscription gives us the strength and support to keep creating powerful, real stories that challenge, inspire, and push us all toward a better world. Because this is not the end. It's the beginning of something greater, and we need you with us. Sometimes the loudest revolutions begin in silence, in a quiet act of dignity, in the calm refusal to bow. What happened to Dr. Marcus Ellington wasn't just about one man being wronged. It was about a community learning to stand taller, speak louder, and demand more. Injustice doesn't always show up in violence. Sometimes it arrives in a uniform, a sideways glance, or the silence of those who should have spoken. But as we've seen, truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs to stand. Is justice only for the powerful? Can silence be just as dangerous as hatred? What would you have done if you were that officer? So now we ask you, dear viewer, would this story have ended the same way if he were someone else, someone without power, without a name? Do we only care when the victim has a badge? Or should we have cared all along? Like, comment, and subscribe to Soulful Stories AFI for more true stories that challenge perception and inspire change.